first movie I took my then girlfriend, now wife, to see in 1975 was a movie called Picnic at Hanging Rock. The fact that this is one of the most boring pieces of theatre ever committed to film is probably a bonus for a young guy on his first date rather than a chore. But I digress. The movie was about a disappearance at Hanging Rock in Australia in the early 20th century on an outing on Valentine's Day. The movie, in fact, is a work of fiction, but really, Valentine's Day has quite a dark, quite a traumatic, quite a bloody history. So let's take a look at the darker, bloody, traumatic side of Valentine's Day. Now, while a day set aside for love and lovers, while great for the greetings card manufacturers and confectionery industry, the florist and the lingerie shops, it's probably less desirable for the single and lonely among us. However, surprisingly and happily, there is little evidence of any increase in suicide or attempted suicide, although I'm sure the depression levels can go up quite high at that time of the year. That is not to say that this day, a time to celebrate romance and love and kissy face fealty, doesn't have a dark side, right from its inception. The origins of this festival of chocolate, flowers and cupids are actually dark, bloody and a bit muddled. One has pinpointed the exact origin of the holiday. One place to start is ancient Rome, and the Roman celebrations were violent. From February the 13th to the 15th, the Romans celebrated the feast of Lupercalia. The men sacrificed a goat and a dog and then whipped women with the hides of the animals they had just slain. The Roman romantics were drunk, they were naked. Young women would line up for the men to hit them. They believed this would make them fertile. The brutal feat included a matchmaking lottery in which young men drew the names of women from a jar. The couple would then be coupled up for the duration of the festival, or longer if the match was right. The ancient Romans may also be responsible for the name of our modern day of love. Emperor Claudius II executed two men, both named Valentines, and their stories got muddled, both on February the 14th of different years. Their martyrdom was honoured by the Catholic Church with the celebration of St. Valentine's Day. As the holiday spread, it evolved. Later, Pope Gelasius muddled things even further in the 5th century by combining St. Valentine's Day with Lupercalia to expel the pagan ritual. But the festival was more of a theatrical interpretation of what it had once been. It was little more than a drunken revel, but the Christians put their clothes back on. That didn't stop it from being a day of fertility and love. Around the same times, the Normans celebrated Valentine's Day. Valentine meant lover of women. That was likely confused with Valentine at some point, in part because they sound alike. As the years went on, the holiday grew sweeter. Chaucer and Shakespeare romanticised it in their work, and it gained popularity throughout Britain and the rest of the world. But its dark side refuses to go away, with many a traumatic event happening around February the 14th. Now, the three next events that I'm going to mention could be seen as traumatic for some and less traumatic for others. And the first one was that in Valentine's Day in 1779, Captain James Cook was killed. Captain James Cook was among Britain's most accomplished explorers. He chartered lands from Newfoundland to New Zealand to Alaska. In 1778, on his third voyage to the Pacific Ocean, he became the first European on record to visit the Hawaiian Islands and was received with honours. He encountered a much different reception, however, when he returned the following year. After one of the crew's small boats was stolen, the captain decided to retaliate, not by seizing a boat of his own, but by holding Hawaiian King hostage. A hostile mob surrounded Cook and his men with the king. When news arrived that the foreigners had shot a local chieftain across the bay, the crowd attacked. Cook shot one man dead, but before he could reload, the captain was clubbed on the head and stabbed repeatedly before dying in the knee-deep waters. In 1891, General William Tecumseh Sherman died. Inside William Tecumseh Sherman's residence on the Upper West Side of New York City, the old warrior succumbed to pneumonia and breathed his last at the age of 71. President Benjamin Harrison, who had served under the general in the Civil War, ordered all national flags to be flown at half-mast to honour the Union General, whose ruthless 1864 march to the sea left a path of destruction across Georgia and proved to be one of the war's decisive moments. 3 former presidents and all the generals who had served under him attended Sherman's funeral, before his body was dressed in full military uniform and transported to St. Louis for burial. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre was a mass murder of a group of unarmed bootlegging gang members in Chicago on February the 14th, 1929. The bloody incident dramatised the intense rivalry for control of the illegal liquor traffic during the Prohibition era in the United States. Disguising themselves as policemen, members of the Al Capone gang entered a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, run by members of the George Bugs Moran gang, lined up their opponents against the wall and shot them in cold blood. The victims included gang members Adam Hare, Frank Geisenberg, Pete Geisenberg, John May, Al Weinshank, and James Clark, as well as a visitor, Dr. Reinhard H. Schwimmer. Moving on almost 20 years later, during the Second World War, American troops were killed at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, in the Atlas Mountains. This was the site of a crushing American defeat during World War II. There, in February 1943, Valentine's Day, German forces led by Erwin Rommel engaged with Allied troops. By the close of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, it was thought that more than 1,000 US soldiers had been killed, with dozens more seized as prisoners. It marked a crushing defeat for America and a step backward in the Allies' North African campaign. During World War II, as we know, there were a lot of atrocities carried out by the Axis side, in particular the Germans. But the Allies weren't immune from their atrocities either. Exactly 80 years ago on Valentine's Day this year, Allied bombing raids took place between February the 13th and the 15th, almost completely destroying the German city of Dresden. The raids became a symbol of terror bombing campaign against Germany, which was one of the most controversial Allied actions of the war. Throughout the war, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill had called for increased British air raids against the population centres of Germany in order to swamp German authorities and services, particularly transportation, with hordes of refugees. As the Allied forces closed in on the Third Reich in 1945, such targets became more feasible because of the air superiority and improved navigation techniques, or so-called, of the Anglo-American bomber force. Dresden was called Florence on the Elbe and was considered one of the world's most beautiful cities because of its architecture and art treasures. Having never previously been attacked in the war, the city offered increased value for terror bombing against an inexperienced population. On the night of February the 13th, the British Bomber Command hit Dresden with an 800 bomber air raid, dropping some 2,700 tons of bombs. including a large number of incendiaries. Aided by weather conditions, a firestorm developed, incinerating tens of thousands of people. The US 8th Air Force followed the next day with another 400 tons of bombs and carried out yet another raid by 210 bombers on February the 15th. It is thought that some 25,000 to 35,000 civilians died in Dresden in the air attacks, though some estimates are as high as 250,000, given an influx of undocumented refugees that had fled to Dresden from the Eastern Front. Most of the victims were women, children, and the elderly. Ever since the 1920s and 1930s, strategic bombing was identified as an important component of warfare by many leading military theorists. One that could paralyse the enemy's industry and the will to fight, thus bringing about a swifter end to any conflict. The theory was perhaps followed most closely by the British and American forces during the Second World War, with hundreds and thousands of tons of bombs being dropped in both day and night raids on German cities at great cost to the lives of both the airmen who undertook them and the civilians who perished in the infernos below. The bombing of Dresden was a historic benchmark that demonstrated the power of strategic bombing. Critics say that the military value of the bombing did not justify Dresden's near destruction and that the city could have been spared, like Rome, Paris and Kyoto. Given the high number of civilian casualties and the relatively few strategic targets, some even called the bombing of Dresden a war crime, though both the British and American militaries defended the bombing as necessary. Although it is noticeable that although fighter command of the RAF have been lauded over the years as the few to which so much is owed by so many, Bomber Command have been virtually sidelined in commemorations over the years. To compound this dark Valentine's Day event, two confused bomber groups of the USAF accidentally bombed Prague. The raid killed hundreds of Czechs and left over 1,000 wounded, while also damaging several of the capital's historic buildings. It was subsequently used in Nazi and communist propaganda and remains a painful memory to this day. Yet few outside the Czech Republic know that some of those bombers headed for Dresden actually bombed Prague instead. A navigational error caused in part by bad weather caused 62 B-17 Flying Fortresses to drop 152 tons of bombs on the Czech capital in less than 10 minutes, completely destroying or damaging 2,351 houses and killing 701 people, according to post-war statistics. As accounts show, some of the pilots were aware of their course was wrong, but chose to stay on their course due to strict orders to keep radio silence. One of those who survived the raid was Dagmar Prochakova. She described the experience for the historical record Memory of Nations. Something was falling, rubble and things like that. I know I was suddenly hiding under the table and then the cabinet. There were dead people everywhere in the streets. Some of the victims perished by being buried alive in their cellars, hiding from the bombs, and were only found decades later in the 1970s. Michael Plavek, the curator of air collection of the National Technical Museum, told Czech Radio, "It was only 25 years after the end of the war, during the reconstruction of one of the houses, that the bodies of 23 victims of the bombing were discovered." While largely forgotten today, the consequences of the bombing did have a permanent imprint on parts of the city. For example, the famous Dancing House building constructed in the 1990s was built in place of a house that was destroyed during the raid. Other famous buildings damaged in the attack included the Baroque Faust House on Charles Square or the synagogue in Vinohrady. A Remembrance Act was held for the victims 4 days later on February 18, 1945, and the Church of St. Ludmilla. A Czech radio recording survives from that day. All of us who are in Prague have sadness in their eyes and hearts. There are tears in our eyes as we see the graves marked with numbers and names of the victims. We have all brought pain and hopelessness to this square, Prague has gathered to say goodbye at his temple with the victims of the terrible attack from the sky, an attack that none of us understand and towards which we can only ask the question, why? Nazi propaganda, of course, took advantage of the bombing mistake, describing it as an Anglo-American terrorist raid, through which the enemy discharged their murderous cynicism on Prague's population and buildings. Even during the communist era, the bombing of Prague remained a useful anti-American propaganda tool. It was not only the Czech capital that saw Allied bombs fall on their houses during Valentine's Day in 1945. Smaller groups that were headed for Dresden also dropped their loads on Plzeň and Karlovy Vary, as well as a few other small towns. The next dark event is one that touches me personally, as it does any Dubliner. But for a series of fortunate events, myself and my wife may well have been right in the middle of it. As it was, my wife, who narrates some of the videos on here, was working in a school in the affected area at the time, and was witness to the heartbreak which is reawakened each year as all the memorials are published on Valentine's Day. On Valentine's night in 1981, actually Valentine's Eve going into Valentine's Day, 48 young people died in a fire in the Stardust nightclub in Artane in North Dublin. It was the largest ever fire disaster in the history of the Irish state. The bulk of those who lost their lives were from the Artane, Coolock and other parts of North Dublin, while 3 of the victims were from Northern Ireland. A further 200 people were injured in the blaze, and the consequences have haunted Dublin ever since. Witnesses from the night said the darkness of the disco and smoke machine disguised the danger at first until the ceiling collapsed. One survivor who was separated from her husband said she knew when she watched the roof fall in that he was dead. A mix of smoke, ash and fire filled the room. The thick 90s-80s carpets provided a natural accelerant, and the fire quickly took place. The place was full of stuff that would not be allowed to be used in a venue in the modern world. One witness said it smelled like a chip pan, like the smell of grease heating up. The young people rushed to the fire exits to find they were locked or chained closed. The club's then manager, Eamon Butley, has since said that the exits had been locked because of a large number of people were getting in for free due to the actions of their friends who were opening the exit doors from the inside. Quite possible they're the sort of things we did get up to in the 70s and 80s, but not a good enough reason to cause the deaths and injuries of so many young people and fly in the face of fire regulations, even the pathetic ones that existed then. People screamed for help and the crush began as firefighters watched helplessly outside. Such was the mayhem with the Stardust. It was literally a free-for-all. It was just get in and get them to hell out of it. That was it. A former fireman, Brian Parks, told an inquest. One rescue worker kicked in a door that had been chain closed. Other crews took ladders to toilet windows and began pulling people out. The toilet windows, incidentally, were barred as well, so people ran to the toilets to escape and found themselves trapped. The aftermath was horrific. The fire service lined the bodies of the young people outside. One fireman told an inquest he found 2 young victims inside with their arms around each other, trying to comfort each other before they met their demise. Another said he found a man's body just steps from safety. In more recent times, there was the Parkland High School shooting, the mass shooting that occurred on Valentine's Day in 2018, when 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz opened fire on students and staff at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, part of the Miami metropolitan area, killing 17 people and injuring 17 others. Cruz, a former student at the school, fled the scene on foot by blending in with other students and was arrested without incident approximately an hour and 20 minutes later in nearby Coral Springs. Police and prosecutors investigating a pattern of disciplinary issues and unnerving behaviour. These are just some of the many, many tragic, violent, and dark events that happen around the holiday that we all love to celebrate as being all about love. So I hope when it comes that your Valentine's Day is filled with love and happiness and togetherness and not with any tinge of darkness and tragedy. If you enjoyed this content, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. Until then, love one another. Slán agus beannacht.